I'm so glad you could join us today. This is Monday, and it's June 22nd, and Meet in Middle. I'm Christine Brown. Now, my guest is Amy Muller, and Amy is with Muller's Funeral Home. And Amy, first of all, can you tell us what Washington State is #2 about? What are we?
Washington State is the second largest cremator in the country. Nevada cremates more than any other state, and Washington State is #2.
#2. I think that would surprise people. But, what about Tri-Cities? How do we fit into that? I mean,
we cremate a lot less than, say, the Seattle area does, but we're right around 70% cremation.
70%?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When did that change? What happened? I mean, I drifted that way myself, but I didn't realize everybody. Why?
A lot of it, the Tri-Cities is a very transient area.
Yeah.
I mean, they say, 25% of the people have lived here 5 years or less. The more transient an area, the more likely the cremation rate will be higher. If you were born and raised in a town and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-grandparents are all down at the local cemetery, you're probably going to be buried in that same cemetery, and that's just your family tradition. One of the other things that's very different about Washington State than a lot of the other states, in the Northeast in particular, they're still very, very traditional. But in Washington State, more than 50% of the people identify themselves as not belonging to any particular religion. And burial versus cremation traditionally had a lot to do with a person's religion. 20 years ago, the Catholic Church would not allow an urn to be brought into the church for a mass. So if you were cremated, you either had to be in a casket, brought to the mass, and then cremated afterwards, or you just said, it's easier just to be buried anyway. So in the last few years, the Catholic Church has really reversed that. They still want the urn present because they want to do a final blessing of the urn. In fact, St. Joe's installed a columbarium, which is a wall of niches down at their church down there. And when Monsignor Dillon passed away a little while ago, he was actually placed in the columbarium there. He was cremated and placed there.
Oh, wow. That does signify a significant change, doesn't it?
It is a big change. And when you look at the religious people, we look towards our leaders and we follow their examples. And so if they've always said burial, 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 and then all of a sudden they switch to cremation, it becomes being something that people will consider. And there's a lot of options that you have with cremation that you don't have with burial. For example, it used to be if somebody died on Wednesday, we knew we were having burial on Saturday. You only have so much time that you can really keep somebody looking decent for viewing and for burial, and so you have a quicker turnaround. If you're cremating and say everybody's scattered across the nation, you wait 2 weeks to have a service because then you can get less expensive airfares.
Okay.
And so, so there's a lot of economics involved in how you make that decision. A lot of people will say, I've only lived in the Tri-Cities for 2 years, and I don't think I'm going to stay here, so I'm going to take this urn home with me.
Oh.
Or, we honeymooned in Jamaica, and I'm going to make a trip. Now, there's special things you have to do to carry ashes overseas, but, we're going to go
Really?
back. Yeah.
What if you don't tell anybody?
Well, they'll probably find out in customs anymore. So, or as you're going through security, if you have something in your bag or in your suitcase, so you need to make sure before you take it out of the country that you're not going to lose your husband as you're going through security.
That'd be terrible.
It would be absolutely horrible. But some people say this. This is where we had our first kiss. This is where I proposed. This. So there's special places where sometimes they say, I want us always to be there together. Now, I was talking with you earlier, and you were talking about family, that their urn, or their ashes were never buried anywhere. So where do you go to visit them? Where, and sometimes you really want to have that connection. And so you can bury the urns at a local cemetery. And then you can have a headstone place, and you always have a place to go and visit.
Okay. We've got a caller on the line, and let's add that person to our conversation. Hi, how about a first name? Hi, Ben.
And that is really cool. And we're working with a group right now. It's the Missing in America project, and they're working to find people that were veterans that served but families never picked up their urns, and we're getting them placed in national cemeteries. But that is really cool to be able to bury the urn and to have the full service and the yeah, that, and you know, the military services are so neat. It's such an honor to be a part of that.
Well, this is KFLD right now, actually. Great. Thank you. Hey, Ben, thanks for calling. So, well, I have some relatives that my parents are both, their ashes are in the San Juan, so I guess I could go to the San Juans and talk to them, but I talk to them every day. I don't need to go there.
Absolutely. And it's important to have that discussion with the family ahead of time, because you'd be surprised how many people have opinions about it. And, you know, I talked with one gal, and she says, I've adamantly told my children, don't separate me, because I don't want my thumb hanging around your neck, and I don't want my toe, you know, in the San Juans, and whatever you do, keep me together.
Oh,
and she's planning on being cremated, but
those
you know,
are preferences, yeah.
Yeah, so you want to make sure you know exactly what your loved one's wishes are and what they're comfortable with.
Yeah. Does it still happen where people die and they have not shared what they want, so then the family is there to try to determine that and cause family havoc?
It's awful. Yes, it happens all the time. And so that's one of the things that I stress over and over, is have the conversation as a family. And if you know that you have children that maybe don't get along very well or haven't talked a lot, make sure whatever you decide you have in writing, you have it witnessed by somebody. Put it on file at a funeral home. Make sure your kids know what funeral home you want to use. You can prepay for everything, and you can indicate at the funeral home, my children are not allowed to make these changes. But we have so many people that does become a big thing. I remember a few years ago, one of my PE teachers passed away, and she had several children, and 2 of them wanted to bury her, and 2 of them wanted to cremate her. And it was, it was such a mess. And it used to be every single child had to agree. Next of kin goes husband, wife, you know, the spouse is always the first next of kin. But if there's no spouse, then it goes to the children. And it used to be every single child had to agree. Washington State has changed it, and probably because of all of these fights family has had, it's majority rules. So if there's 5 kids, 3 have to say, yes, we're going to cremate, or yes, we're going to bury. It was a deadlock, 2 and 2, you know, and it was just, they brought their attorneys, and they were so angry, and some of it goes back to, you know, Mom used to always go to your football game and not mine, and they didn't say that, but you know, you can see that. It goes back to all of the hurts from your whole entire life, and, well, you wore my clothes and ruined them when we were teenagers, all those petty little things. When end of life comes, all of those things come, and Mom's not there anymore to keep the peace. So I always say, have your plan, have it written, have it witnessed, and don't allow that fighting to happen amongst your children.
That's a really, really good piece of advice. Wow. Let me give you our phone number again if you want to call. Maybe you've got a question for Amy, or you want to make a comment. That number is 509-547-8726. I want to go back to, because I think one of the big questions always is, it's always about cost. I'm always curious about money. So what is the difference these days between burial and cremation?
So the big difference in cost between burial and cremation, because it costs me the same amount of money to take care of a cremation family as a burial family. You know, I have my overhead expenses, and regardless of what you choose, those are my expenses that I have to pay for. So the big cost is a casket. If you're being cremated, the body still has to be placed in something to be put in the crematory. But there are very inexpensive containers that just get burned up that you can get. But sometimes, you know, the Indians in Arizona purchase African mahogany caskets, and they cremate African mahogany caskets. Those are $8,000–9,000 caskets. Most people don't do that. Most people will spend less than $1,000 on a cremation casket. Most spend between $75 and $200, but usually we're less than $1,000. For a traditional casket, you're looking anywhere from $900 to $9,000, depending on what you choose. So the casket is going to cost you a lot more on a burial than on a cremation. And then a burial, you know, with an urn, you can choose to take the urn home and never go to a cemetery with it, or hold on to it for a couple of years and then go to a cemetery. Whereas with a casket, you have to do something right away. And you're gonna spend anywhere between $2,000 and $10,000 here locally to have somebody buried in a cemetery.
Okay. So are there caskets these days that are biodegradable? Is that allowed?
So there are there are some, and green burials are becoming something that is more and more common, which means the body is actually placed inside of a biodegradable shroud or a biodegradable casket, and then placed in a cemetery that doesn't use any kind of concrete liner.
Yes.
And so that shroud or casket is placed directly on the dirt, and then it's supposed to encourage the decomposition of the body quicker. There are a few on the west side. There aren't any over here. I have some concerns about what would happen to our water supply. You know, animals die all the time and people treat it, and I just haven't gotten to the point where that's something that we've seriously looked at to do at any of our own cemeteries. But there are the biodegradable caskets. There's a wicker casket that we allow people to use in the cemetery. They have handles on it. But in our cemeteries, every casket is placed inside of some kind of a liner. And so it's usually a concrete
liner of
like
concrete.
a concrete.
Yeah.
And that allows for the grass to stay even. If you go to some of the older cemeteries, you see big dips, and that's and that's because things have fallen in. But the liner protects that so that it stays more beautiful. It's more park-like.
Oh, we have so many more questions that we want to ask Amy. Yes, I want to know about just trends in terms of celebrating people's lives. I have looked at that lately, and it just seems so much better to celebrate a life than to mourn a death. So I want to talk with her about that, and we'd love to take your questions, 547-8726. All right, we have Amy Kaufman in our studio, and she just reminded me that her last name is Kaufman. It's not Muller right now, but Amy is with Muller's Funeral Home. So, Amy, what kind of trends do we see in terms of people doing celebrations or some kind of service, memorials for their loved ones?
So we've been seeing for about the last 15 or 20 years, people are kind of pulling away from the traditional church service. And I think a lot of it has to do with what we talked about before, that fewer and fewer people are belonging to churches. And so they don't have the traditional, you know, with some faiths, you know exactly what's going to happen. You have the rosary the night before, the mass the day of, burial. But when you don't have that religious tradition, you create your own tradition. And so some people will have a big barbecue, you know, and they'll say he loved to grill, and so we're going to have this big barbecue with his favorite rib recipe, and you know, whatever, the whole 9 yards. But one of the things I have to caution people about, yes, a funeral is about the life that has lived, and we need to celebrate that life. But I've sat in trainings with world-renowned grief counselors, and they talk about how important it is to mourn and to grieve. And when we decide that all we're going to do is have a party, we haven't grieved. And part of the important part of a funeral is gathering your friends with you and being able to be sad and to be able to publicly grieve and to be able to have that support. Because if you have to grieve at some point, and it's more helpful to do it when you have friends there that can console you. If you keep your upper lip all, you know, and you're just a stiff upper lip and everything's good and I'm fine, and you're gonna crash. And it's better to have the opportunity sooner rather than later to rely on your friends, to depend on your friends. And the further we get away from community, the more likely it is we're never going to get through a healthy grief. I don't think you ever get over a death. You learn how to live through it. You get to a healthy grieving state. And you know, this counselor, a couple of years ago I went and spent all day at his seminar. He talked about this young child, and the family did one of those big barbecue celebrations, and it was for her grandpa. And her grandpa was her very best friend and her fishing buddy, and she just absolutely loved him, thought he was the greatest thing in the world. And he died, and now they were having this big, huge party, and all she wanted to do was cry.
Yeah.
And so she ended up in counseling, trying to figure out how she can work through this. Why is everyone happy because Grandpa died? I'm devastated.
Yeah.
And so I caution people, yes, it's okay to celebrate, but make sure you allow everybody an opportunity to grieve that life. Celebrate the life, but allow grief to happen. It's very important to our psyche.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Okay, we'll take that one in. I want to know who is financially responsible for, you know, post-death. I mean, what if people just walked away? Who is responsible for that?
So technically, the person who signs the contract is the person that's responsible. The individual's estate is ultimately responsible. However, we always have somebody sign a contract because we can't wait 6 months, 2 years, 10 years for probate to be over, for everything to be settled. You know, we have bills to pay just like everybody else does, and we need to be paid sooner rather than later. But ultimately, the family is responsible for the individual. Years ago, the state used to have, they had welfare funerals, and they would pay so much money for somebody who was either indigent, or if somebody was on state aid, they were living in a nursing home under Medicaid or something like that, the state would pay for a funeral. And the funeral profession got together and they said, you know what, you have a lot of people cheating the system. There's a lot of people that, yeah, in life they really needed help to be in a nursing home, but the kids have plenty of money. Every once in a while we're going to have to write off something here and there because somebody really won't have money. We would rather write off 1 or 2 here and there than have somebody who lives, you know, a $500,000 home and drives fancy cars use the state's funds. So let us take the brunt of that, and we will do that because in the long run it's going to serve everybody better. And so it saved the state a lot of money, and it made families be responsible for the choices that they make. You know, we would have people that would have the welfare funerals, and then they would buy really expensive floral arrangements to put on top of the casket because it was such an ugly casket that the state would pay for. And you know, they would spend more on the flowers than what the state paid for the funeral, and you go, no, you could have afforded to pay that. Why is the state paying for this when you can afford to do that? But ultimately it is the family that is responsible. And that's another thing. You know, the baby boomers, they've been telling us for years that the baby boomers were going to start dying in mass quantities, and we really it's been the big thing.
It has.
And you know, and they've been telling funeral homes for years to prepare for this because you're going to need to have more staff, you're going to need more this and that, and it really hasn't started. It's been trickling, but it hasn't been, you know, what all of the analysts said was going to happen. But I think about me, my parent, well, technically my dad isn't a baby boomer, my mom is, and I think about if I had to pay for their funeral today, how would I do that? How would I be able to do that? Now financially, my parents are able to take care of those arrangements today. They can come in and they can, you know, they can either do an insurance policy and pay for a couple of years, month to month, or they can pay a lump sum. My parents financially can take care of themselves, and they ought to. Not everybody can. But why would you leave that burden to your 30-year-old, 40-year-old kid who's just starting out in life, has small kids, kids in high school, maybe getting ready for college, have all these financial responsibilities, and you're leaving them that burden?
Yeah. So again, I guess you're advising us that we better be talking about it and planning for it.
Please do.
Us baby boomers. So do you think it's because people are living longer and the baby boomers are just an example of that, living longer? Or what?
I do believe that's a lot of it. The baby boomer generation is going to live longer than any other generation in the past. You know, medicine is so much greater, and they've just lived healthier lives. You know, the baby boomer generation didn't smoke as much as their parents did. They, you know, they've just lived a healthier lifestyle, and there's so many medications. But yes, start having the talk of a lifetime. Talk about what's important to you, what your wishes are, what you want to have. Financially, how do you want this to play out? Who's going to take care of it? You know, and look at your kids and go, oh, yeah, they'll be able to, you know, I already have funds set up so they can take care of it. Great. But there are ways that you can pay today lock in today's prices,
Mm-hmm.
live for 30 more years.
Yeah.
Great, we want you to live for a very long time. But at that point, when inflation goes up, because it always does, your prices are covered. Your kids don't have to worry about
It's
it.
kind of like going to college on the GEP program, only it's doing the cremation or burial. Okay, I want to change the subject a little bit because I know that you have expanded your business to do cremation of pets.
Yes.
And boy, oh boy, people's pets are their children, they're their grandchildren. I cannot believe how connected people have become to their pets. And, you know, I got to speak for myself too. I'm the same way. I got a dog and he's just, you know, so important to me. So what's going on with that business? How well is it doing, cremating pets?
You know, it's been really interesting, just the difference between when we work with people that are mourning the loss of a human or the loss of their furry friend. You know, 2 legs or 4 legs, we're going to serve all of you. Your furry friends, your family, we want to serve you, we want to take care of you. We have a couple of contracts with a couple of local veterinarians.
Yes.
And so when they have an animal that passes away or that they have put down, we go and we bring them into our care and we take care of the animal and then return them to the families. Some people don't want the ashes back, and so we dispose of the ashes. And there is a different price involved, as you know, if you want the ashes back or if you don't want the ashes back. But we probably take care of 100 and some animals a month.
100 and some animals a month?
Yeah.
Wow.
And we're not working with very many vets. We take care of private animals as well. And we'll come to your home if you want. We'll come to your home and pick your animal up and bring them to our facility. Of course, there is an extra charge for us to come to the home. Most people will bring the animal to us. They're small enough, they can carry them, they can lift them. It's not a big deal. But, you know.
So the days of burying your dog in the backyard is just not that frequent anymore.
I remember as a teenager, my parents had taken my older sister to college, and I had soccer practice or something, had to stay home, and our cat had been missing for a few days, and somebody comes up and they says, "Are you missing an animal?" Yeah. I go to the field and there's my cat, and so I dug a hole in the backyard and put the cat in this little grave that I had dug, and next day he'd been dug up.
Yes. Yeah, so that's not good.
And I didn't bury very deep. It's kind of hard to dig a grave, and I was little and whatever, not that little, old enough to stay home alone. But you know, I just remember that was traumatic for me, knowing that the animal had been dug up by another animal.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing. You know, people used to live in their homes for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you know. The house passed to the next person. And so you might have a little garden area that there's 5 family animals in there. They say we move every 7 years or something like that. People aren't staying. Do you want to leave Fido in the backyard? So a lot of people are cremating, and then they can take the ashes with them to the next house.
Or they can do something interesting with the ashes. I've seen all kinds of things, like ashes inside of glass bulbs or different things like that. I mean, yeah.
And there's even a company that will make diamonds out of ashes.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things that you can do. You know, you don't have to just leave them on a shelf, but you know, certainly it's something to consider. But you know, it's been really eye-opening to work with the pet families and to see how much love is out there, and how, you know, it's just, and a lot of times it's the empty nesters. You know, they've raised their kids, and these are their second group of kids, and our furry kids don't talk back. You know?
I know, they're lovely.
Yeah,
they're really
you
really
come home
great
at night and they are just so excited to see you, and they sit on your lap, and they, you know, every once in a while they make a mess in the house. But
and the sad thing about animals, though, is that they live shorter lives. That's the bum deal of it. Amy Kaufman, thank you so much for joining us today. We've learned a lot, and I hope that this means that some people will be going and talking to their relatives tonight. Yeah, take advantage of that. Muller's Funeral Home, thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate that. We're back in a moment to wrap up today.